Hey everybody, welcome back. Well, many of you have probably seen this fantastic three-part miniseries that was done on the History Channel about the life of Ulysses S. Grant. And I was really excited when I saw that they were going to do that because about a year ago, I was on my way driving to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where I was going to be speaking at a high school near Gettysburg. And I decided to listen to Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses S. Grant. I had loved Chernow's biography on Hamilton. It's the biography on which the musical was based. And so after enjoying that one, I wanted to check out another one of his biographies. Stumbled on Grant, and I honestly can say that I've never gone through a book that has changed my opinion about a person or event in history as much as that biography did. Completely changed my view of Grant to where Grant has now become one of my historical heroes, one of the people I most look up to. Well, it was on my way to the hotel in Gettysburg that I listened to the first 4.5 hours of that biography. And this was before the History Channel did their series that was based on Chernow's biography. And I actually recorded my initial reactions to that in my hotel room with my computer webcam, so it's not the best quality, but I thought I would share it with you because it really gives you some insights into my very first reactions to that biography, and it'd be a great opportunity for us to start a conversation about a man who I don't think gets enough credit for the human being that he was and for some of the things that he did as president. And certainly we all know about his military history, but there's so much more to his story. So join me in listening to what I had to say in January of 2020 when I first dove into the biography of Grant. And use the comment section below to let me know your thoughts, and we'll continue this conversation with a part 2 afterwards. Please hit that like button. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want to have a hand in choosing what future content goes on this channel, consider joining us as a member of the Patreon team. The link's in the description. Let's check it out together. I am in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for the next couple of days. It's about a 4.5 hour drive from my house, and as I often do when I have long drives like this for my work, I like to listen to audiobooks through Audible. And I'm listening to Ron Chernow's biography of Ulysses S. Grant. I loved his biography of Hamilton, and I wanted to try another one and see what I thought, and it's fantastic so far. Love everything that he does, it seems. But the reason I wanted to talk about General Grant, President Grant, is to talk a little bit about what I've learned and how it's impacted the way that I view General Grant. I'm a huge fan of learning about the American Civil War. I would say in all of the areas of history, it's probably the one area I would definitely consider myself to be an expert. I have been a student of the American Civil War since I was probably 8 or 9 years old. I've read every book I can get my hands on. I can tell you the names of every brigade commander at the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm just really that into it. But I'll confess that when it came to General Grant, outside of what he did during the American Civil War, I didn't know a whole lot more than the basics. I knew that his father grew up where I grew up in Ohio, right outside of Youngstown. I know his grandmother, Rachel Kelly Grant, buried just a couple miles away from my house. I knew that General Grant was born in southwest Ohio, down near Cincinnati, that he lived in Galena, Illinois after his military service, that he was kind of a moderate student at West Point, and then that he was not a great president after the war, and then he hurriedly wrote his memoirs before dying of throat cancer at the end of his life in his early 60s. That's really about all I knew. And I'll be honest too, I've never thought that highly of General Grant as a tactician. My attitude was always, what set him apart from the other generals was that he knew what the Union had and he was willing to use it. That I didn't think he necessarily outsmarted Robert E. Lee so much as bludgeoned him to death with overwhelming firepower and numbers and material. So that's really about it. So I've been listening to this biography of Ulysses S. Grant, and I have to confess that already, and I'm only up to right at the end of his initial military service when he resigned from the Army in the mid-1850s, I have completely changed my opinion of the man, Ulysses S. Grant. I haven't gotten to the parts about the war yet, so I don't know where that's going to go. But I can't believe nobody's made a movie about this guy. Some of you may know more about him than I do, but let's just talk about this for a little bit because I want to have a conversation about Ulysses S. Grant. So the kid grows up. He's the oldest child in his family. He's got a father who is not a real affectionate guy, but I think wants to do right by his son. And he's a tanner, honorable work, but not a work you're going to get really rich on. He's also kind of meddling in politics. He initially is a Jacksonian Democrat, ends up being a Whig. They're staunch abolitionists in his family, even though they live in southern Ohio, which is very near to Kentucky, which is a slave state. And long story short, after putting Ulysses, which his name was Hiram Ulysses Grant, which I think many of us knew that, but he always went by Ulysses. He didn't like the name Hiram and didn't like having his initial spelling Hug. So he always went by Ulysses Grant or Ulysses or something like that. So Ulysses, growing up, went to a series of private schools. His father wanted him to have a good education. Well, financial things turned for the worse, and he's not able to continue giving him that private education. So he does the next best thing. He finds out there's an opening at West Point from their district, and he arranges to have Ulysses appointed to the military academy at West Point. Well, there's one problem. Ulysses doesn't want to go to West Point. I never knew this. I just assumed he did. He didn't want to go to West Point, but he believed in being obedient to his father, so he goes. And he doesn't think he's going to pass the entrance exam, figures it's going to be really quick. He's actually hoping that something bad will happen along the way so that maybe he won't have to go. Then he hears that maybe they're going to close down West Point, and he hopes that happens so he doesn't have to be a student. Hated every minute of being a student, but devoted himself to it. He was actually a fantastic math student. He excelled in math, didn't do well in the military classes at West Point. While he's there, he meets people like James Longstreet, who he became good friends with, George Pickett, and he had a friendship even into the Mexican War. That's where he meets William Tecumseh Sherman for the first time, and a number of others. I think George B. McClellan was a classmate of his. McClellan was a brilliant student. He goes to college at like 13, enters West Point at 16, just a brilliant guy. But that kind of set the first stage in kind of pushing the direction of Grant's life. So Grant graduates from West Point, and there's all these stories about what an incredible horseman Grant was. Apparently, even as a child, he was fantastic. He would like stand on the back of the horse and balance on one foot going full speed as like a 5-year-old. And he just always had this incredible aptitude for being able to be an incredible horseman. And so he would often have opportunities at West Point to show this off. And I just found all of that really fascinating. He got demerits regularly. He was a lot of times late or kind of talked back sometimes. But everybody who knew him said what an incredible guy he was, said he's going to go far. I think everybody who met him and got to know him recognized that this was a special person, even if he didn't do well in classes. So I found that fascinating. Another thing I found fascinating was the way his attitude was about things like women and also things like swearing. I'd always read that he didn't really swear a whole lot. Obviously being in the military, there's that whole idea that being in the military means you swear all the time, stuff like that. He was so sickened by the idea of swearing that apparently one time he said the word darn in the heat of passion over something, and said it aided him for weeks that he had said that word. That's how Grant saw things like that. He also believed in the temperance movement, which was the idea that alcohol should be banned altogether. His father had struggled with alcohol at times. His grandfather, I believe, was an alcoholic. So all of this kind of played into who Grant was. Now, being such a great horseman, he wanted to go into the cavalry when he left West Point, but he didn't get an appointment. He ended up in the 4th U.S. Infantry. He gets sent to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, Missouri. One of his good friends at West Point had been Frederick Dent. So when he's at Jefferson Barracks, he happens to be just a few miles away from Frederick Dent's family's home. Apparently, James Longstreet, another friend of Grant, is somehow related to the Dent family, and so they go together to meet the family. They're slave-owning family. They're very, very different than the abolitionist family that Grant grows up in. And it's there that he meets his future wife, Julia Dent. Again, long story short, won't get into that, but Grant wants to pursue a relationship with Julia. But Julia's father, Frederick Dent, has no interest in Grant whatsoever. Does everything he can to keep his daughter away from this guy because he feels like a military life is beneath her, that she's never going to have the kind of life that he wants her to have. And so when Grant's going to be sent off to fight in the Mexican War and he gets kind of shipped elsewhere, he proposes to Julia, and they're actually engaged for something like 4 years before he finally gets her to marry him. And Julia, that relationship will define the rest of Grant's life, as I've been learning. But I want to talk about the Mexican War, because the Mexican War is where I think there should be a movie made about this guy. Just reading a little bit about the exploits of Grant during the Mexican War, he goes as a brevet second lieutenant. He's like the bottom of the bottom rung of officers in Mexico, serving under first under Zachary Taylor and later under Winfield Scott. Zachary Taylor was somebody that I think became a model for Grant in terms of how he became a general. He wasn't the guy who was all concerned about ceremony and having the cheers of his troops and looking the best with the amazing uniform and all this stuff. He was just kind of the soldier's soldier. But I think he learned a lot from Winfield Scott as well. But anyway, Grant does all of these incredible things. At one point, in one of the battles, he has them disassemble a cannon and take it up into the, I think, the bell tower of a church and reassemble it up there so they can fire it from there. At one point, he was asked to to go for help or to go for ammunition, or I can't remember what it was, but because he was such a great horseman and there were snipers everywhere, he actually rides the horse by laying, like, kind of, you know, the thing you see in the movies where he hangs over the side so they can't see him, and he rides that way like that to go and get the help that they need. One point he finds George Pickett at night, and he's freezing, and Pickett's just kind of overwhelmed and just not really kind of handling himself well, and Grant kind of calms him down and gets him warm, gives him something to eat, some kind of pepper or something that he said, this will warm your insides. But more than anything, what I found fascinating in hearing what other people said about Grant was his incredible calm under fire. They said that nothing rattled this guy, that he always kind of was clear-headed and knew what to do and never seemed to be shaken by what was happening on the battlefield. So there were a lot of stories like that, a lot of stories about his bravery on the field, about other things that he did that were just incredible and fascinating to me. And I would really encourage you to read up on Ulysses S. Grant during the Mexican War, because I really think there ought to be a movie about that. They're just incredible stuff. And I found myself really impressed by the guy from what I heard. So after the Mexican War, he finally gets to marry Julia. And it was actually toward the end of the war when, number one, he's separated from her, and number two, he's bored because they're an occupation army at this point, that he really starts to fall into trouble with alcohol. And it was kind of the defining characteristic of his binges of alcoholism. This wasn't a guy who was drunk all the time, year-round. This was a guy who fell into bouts of drunkenness. And they usually happened when, number one, he was separated from Julia, and number two, he was bored because not a lot was happening. That happened in his early war service, it happened in the interwar service, and it happened that way during the Civil War. And he and Julia, even after their marriage, at times were separated for a number of years. Other things I just found fascinating about Grant, he seemed to be a man ahead of his times when it came to his view of African Americans as well as Native Americans. Now, I'm not saying that he always did the right thing. He did live in the middle 1800s, and there was a particular cultural aspect to all of that. But I think more than most people, he was ahead of his times on that stuff. But there's so much that I've learned. And more than anything, I guess, and I can't give you any specific examples except to say that in listening to this book, I heard a lot of examples. He was just a good dude. He was a nice guy. He's the kind of person that I've learned more and more about him today. I found myself wanting to hang out with him. I thought he'd be a good friend. He'd be the kind of person you'd want to have as a friend. He wasn't perfect. He found himself kind of repeatedly being misled, being kind of scammed on his money, being played by people. And that went all the way into his presidency, where he had very corrupt people in his administration that kind of took advantage of him. But I think it was all motivated out of the right reasons. When he was in the military and he was separated from his wife for a number of years and his two young sons at the time, I think he was constantly trying to find a way to get his wife to him, either to get her to him or to be able to leave the military to be with her. And I think that caused him to constantly kind of fall for get-rich-quick schemes, hoping the next thing would be the one that would allow him the freedom to be able to leave the army or to bring his wife to him. So it was always motivated by these pure motives, not necessarily because he wanted to be a rich man, but because he wanted to be able to have a life that wasn't separated from his wife. There was one particular fascinating story where the 4th Infantry Regiment that he was assigned to as the quartermaster had to be reassigned to the West Coast, and they had to travel through Panama, which there was no Panama Canal, and something like 1/7 of all the men died, as well as all of the children. I think there were 20 children on the ship with them, children of men on the ship or of other travelers. And Grant handled himself so incredibly honorably during that whole situation, tried to help everybody he could, tried to protect, tried to do what he could to keep these folks alive. And just one more example. So there's so much more, and I can't wait to dive into more of this book. But the reason I share all of that is because I want to leave you with this question. Who in history have you found yourself having one opinion of, and then somewhere along the lines you learned more about them, and you found yourself completely changing your opinion of that person? Because I find myself doing that with Grant. I never thought Grant was bad, or like I never disliked Grant, but he was never kind of a hero or like somebody I really found fascinating or looked up to. But that's changing. I gotta say, I'm a fan of Ulysses S. Grant. So let me know who you think about when you think of people whose the idea that you once had of them has changed. Use the comment section below. Let's talk more about Grant. There's so much more than I was able to share in like a 10-minute video, but I'm excited to have this conversation. And if you like this sort of thing, we'll do more of it. So let me know your thoughts. Thanks, guys.